The story first began to ripple across the news cycle in the most unexpected way, with glossy magazine covers and gossip columns all plastered with the same striking photographs. Oliver Harrington, the 43-year-old billionaire, walking hand in hand with a woman the public had never seen before. He was a man used to being photographed in the company of tall, slender models, women whose lives were defined by fashion weeks, champagne flutes, and exotic beach villas. Yet here he was, smiling faintly beside Clara Wood, a 29-year-old shop assistant from a quiet industrial town. Clara was plus size, with round cheeks and soft eyes that seemed to carry a warmth that even the cold lenses of paparazzi cameras couldn't dim. Her brown hair was tied back in most of the early photos, and her clothes were simple, practical, and clearly chosen without any consideration for red carpet glamour. The initial reaction in the press was confusion, followed by fascination. Tabloids splashed headlines like "Billionaire's Unlikely Bride Stuns Nation" and asterisk, "The love story nobody saw coming." Social media erupted in debates about whether the relationship was genuine or some elaborate stunt. Many saw Clara as a breath of fresh air in a world obsessed with appearances. Others assumed there had to be a catch, that perhaps she was hiding her own wealth, or that the marriage was part of some eccentric publicity scheme. In public, Oliver seemed calm and unbothered by the scrutiny. He appeared in tailored three-piece suits, sunglasses shading his eyes from flashing cameras, and his arm rested casually around Clara's shoulders in almost every photograph. Clara, on the other hand, looked both shy and slightly overwhelmed. Her gaze often lowered as though she still couldn't believe her life had changed so dramatically behind the scenes. However, the truth was nothing like the fairy tale image being sold to the masses. Oliver Harrington's marriage to Clara was not a love story born from chance meetings or shared values. It was the result of a cruel wager made in the dimly lit drawing room of an exclusive countryside estate, a place where billionaires and aristocrats gathered for drinks, cigars, and private games of social cruelty. Oliver's friends, men who wore their wealth like armor, had long teased him about his predictable taste in women. They claimed he couldn't possibly connect with someone who didn't fit his narrow vision of beauty and status. One evening, the teasing evolved into a challenge, and the challenge soon became a bet. Marry a woman who defied every expectation, keep up the act for 1 full year, and then humiliate her in a very public setting. The terms were not just spoken. Over laughter, they were written down, signed, and agreed upon. The stakes were staggeringly high. If Oliver succeeded, he would walk away with £5 million in winnings from the other members of his inner circle. If he failed, he would lose twice that amount, not to mention the blow to his ego. Oliver accepted, without hesitation. For him, it was just another high-stakes game, no different from the ruthless business deals he made on a daily basis. The only difference was that this game required a living, breathing person to play the role of his pawn. Clara entered the picture just weeks later. She was working the shift at a high-end clothing store in London, filling in for a friend who had called in sick. Oliver had walked in to buy an expensive watch as a gift for a business associate, and something about the sight of Clara, standing behind the counter in a plain cardigan and modest skirt, struck him immediately, not because he was attracted to her, but because she was perfect for the bet. She wasn't from his world, didn't seem impressed by wealth, and carried herself with a quiet sincerity that was the opposite of the polished, Women who usually filled his evenings. From that first meeting, Oliver set the plan in motion. He returned to the store the next day under the guise of buying cufflinks, then again later that week to ask her opinion on a tie. He learned her name, her background, and that she still lived in the same town where she had grown up. Within a month, he invited her to dinner. Clara was hesitant, thinking it was a casual meal to thank her for helping him choose his purchases. But the evening unfolded like something out of a romantic film. Oliver knew exactly how to make a woman feel seen. Attentive glances, small compliments, stories told just the right way. For Clara, it was dizzying. Soon, the invitations became more frequent. Clara found herself being whisked away to expensive restaurants, rooftop bars with sweeping views of the city, and weekend trips to the countryside. She had never experienced anything like it before. He showered her with small gifts, a silk scarf, a delicate necklace, tickets to a play she had once mentioned liking. Oliver in public was the picture of a devoted partner. But in private, every moment was calculated. He documented their outings for his friends, sending them updates on the progress of the bet. They laughed among themselves, trading remarks about how convincing the act was. Within 6 months, Oliver proposed. The proposal took place during a weekend getaway at a luxury estate in Scotland, complete with a private chef and a string quartet. Clara, still convinced she had somehow stumbled into a miracle of fate, said yes without hesitation. News of the engagement hit the tabloids instantly. The public was both stunned and enchanted. In interviews, Oliver spoke of their unexpected love and how meeting Clara had changed him. Clara blushed shyly when reporters asked about their wedding plans. By the time they married, the UK had fully bought into the story. The wedding was a lavish but strangely intimate affair, with only a handful of guests, most of them Oliver's wealthy friends who knew the real reason for the event. Clara's family sat near the front, their faces a mixture of joy and disbelief at how their daughter's life had transformed. The photographs from that day painted a picture of perfection. The billionaire and the shop assistant, united by love and defiance of social norms. But beneath the beautiful images, the truth was far darker. Clara was not a partner in Oliver's life. She was a prop, a move in a high-stakes game he intended to win at all costs. Every smile for the cameras, every public gesture of affection, was another step toward the night when he would reveal it had all been a cruel joke. For Oliver, the thrill came not from the marriage itself, but from imagining the moment the mask would come off. Clara, still blissfully unaware, believed she had found her forever home in his world, never suspecting that she was living inside the opening chapter of a plan designed to break her completely. The night the bet was made remained seared into Oliver Harrington's memory, not because of the alcohol or the expensive cigars, but because of the smug satisfaction on the faces of the men who had challenged him. It had been one of those winter gatherings in the Cotswolds where wealth pooled in every corner, antique chandeliers casting golden light over velvet armchairs, a fire roaring in the hearth, the scent of aged whiskey drifting in the air. Oliver and his friends had been playing their usual games of one-upmanship, trading tales of business conquests, exotic purchases, and romantic exploits. They thrived on competition, feeding off each other's arrogance like it was fine wine. Someone, half daring and half mocking, brought up Oliver's predictable dating life. pointing out that he had never strayed from his preferred type. Tall, thin, glamorous women who could be plastered across magazine covers. It was said with a smirk, but in their circle, such jabs were designed to cut. Oliver had never been one to back down from a challenge, and before the night was over, the idea had solidified into something concrete. The challenge was not just to date someone unsuitable in their cruel, narrow view of beauty. He had to marry her. The woman had to be someone who would turn heads for the wrong reasons in their social circles. Someone the public would find surprising. Someone they believed he could never convincingly love. And most importantly, he had to keep up the act for an entire year before delivering a public humiliation so grand it would be talked about for months. If he pulled it off, his friends would collectively pay him £5 million. If he failed, he would owe each of them, and the price would double. It was more than just money. It was pride, reputation, the intoxicating thrill of control. He accepted with a cool smile, already running through possibilities in his mind. This wasn't about attraction or compatibility. This was about strategy. He needed someone genuine, unsuspecting, and easy to mold into the role. When Clara Wood appeared in his path just weeks later, it felt almost too perfect. She was working behind the counter in a high-end menswear store, a world away from the clientele she served. Her clothes were practical, her makeup understated, her manner polite but unpracticed in the art of flattering the wealthy. She didn't fawn over him or act impressed when she rang up his watch purchase. She seemed mildly curious about him, but not drawn in by the aura of wealth he carried effortlessly. Oliver knew instantly she would be ideal. She was everything his friends would never expect and everything the public would latch onto. A working class background, plus size, and far removed from the glossy, curated lives of the women in his past. She was the perfect contrast to him. He began returning to the store with calculated regularity, creating excuses to speak to her, asking her opinion on items he didn't care about, dropping hints about his life without revealing too much. Clara didn't know it then, but from the moment he stepped back into that store for the second time, she had been marked as a piece in a private, poisonous game. Within weeks, Oliver had drawn her into his orbit. He offered dinners at places she had only seen in magazines, weekend trips to luxury hotels, and small, thoughtful gifts that seemed deeply personal, but were carefully chosen for effect. He asked questions about her life, her dreams, her childhood. He made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. Clara, cautious at first, began to relax under the steady warmth of his attention. She told herself not to get carried away, but the intensity of his pursuit made that impossible. He was charming, attentive, and in her mind, far too good for her, a thought he subtly encouraged without ever saying it outright. Oliver documented everything for his friends. He would send them photos from dinners, videos of her laughing at something he'd said, updates on how quickly she was falling for him. They responded with their own brand of toxic encouragement, mocking her behind closed doors and congratulating him on his progress. Each time he felt a thrill of control. It wasn't love he was cultivating, it was dependency. He knew the more he gave her, the harder it would be for her to imagine life without him, and the greater the impact when it was all taken away. When he proposed 6 months later, it was not because he felt ready for marriage, but because it was the logical next step in the plan. The proposal was staged to perfection. A weekend away in Scotland, a private dining room filled with candlelight, a small orchestra playing in the background. Clara's eyes had welled with tears before he even finished speaking, and she said, "Yes," in a voice that trembled with disbelief. That night, while she was still reeling from happiness, Oliver sent a brief message to his inner circle. Step 3 complete. The engagement thrust them into the public spotlight. Tabloids couldn't get enough of the fairy tale couple, painting them as proof that love could overcome any difference. Interviews and photo shoots followed. Oliver played the role flawlessly, speaking about their unexpected connection and how Clara had changed his outlook on life. Clara, shy but glowing, would nod beside him, unaware of the performance she was part of. Every appearance tightened the web around her. The wedding was exactly as Oliver intended, a spectacle wrapped in intimacy. The venue was a sprawling countryside estate, with manicured gardens and a hall lit by crystal chandeliers. Clara's dress was elegant but understated, a deliberate choice to enhance the image of simplicity and sincerity. Her family sat proudly, some of them still visibly stunned that their daughter had found herself in such an extraordinary match. Oliver's friends, however, sat like an audience waiting for the next act in a play they had helped write. They knew the real reason for the day, and the satisfaction they felt was almost tangible. From the outside, the marriage looked charmed. The couple was photographed on luxury yachts, strolling hand in hand through European cities and attending charity. Jealous. Clara's wardrobe evolved under Oliver's influence, shifting from simple dresses to designer gowns. To her, it felt like a transformation born of love and generosity. To him, it was part of the conditioning, remolding her into a figure that would make the final act all the more devastating. Every gift, every vacation, every word of encouragement was carefully measured. Oliver controlled their public image down to the smallest detail. He decided which photos would be posted online, which events they would attend, and how she would be presented to the world. At the same time, he subtly isolated her from her old life. Visits to her family became less frequent, often cut short by urgent business matters. Friends from her hometown drifted away, unsure how to fit into her new world. Clara told herself it was simply the cost of marrying someone with his responsibilities. Oliver's friends continued to monitor the progress of the bet with cruel amusement. Private messages flew back and forth, speculation about when he would choose to end it, suggestions for the most humiliating way to reveal the truth. The charity ball, held each winter in London and attended by the country's most influential figures, emerged as the leading option. It would be the perfect stage. Oliver kept that thought tucked away, letting it grow in his mind, feeding on the anticipation of the moment when Clara's world would collapse in front of hundreds of witnesses. Clara, meanwhile, remained unaware of the shadows curling around her life. She thought her marriage was the product of fate, of a love so rare it had bridged an impossible gap. She didn't see that every step forward had been laid out before her, every choice shaped by hands that meant her no kindness. She didn't know that she wasn't living a dream at all. She was walking, slowly and unknowingly, toward the edge of a cliff built just for her. Months into the marriage, Clara's life looked nothing like it had before. She had gone from living above a small bakery in a quiet industrial town to waking up in penthouse apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking city skylines. Her days were filled with fittings for designer gowns, appearances at charity luncheons, and trips to destinations she had only ever read about in magazines. Oliver moved her through this world with practiced ease, always one step ahead, always directing the pace of her transformation. She told herself she was lucky to have a husband so capable and attentive, someone who seemed to think of everything before she even realized she needed it. But the shine began to dull in subtle ways. She started to notice how her life outside of Oliver's carefully arranged schedule was shrinking. Friends she had grown up with sent fewer messages, often saying they didn't know where she fit anymore. When she suggested visiting her parents, Oliver would agree, but the trips were always brief and filled with distractions, business calls that pulled him away, events they had to attend nearby. Even her small pleasures, like sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and reading quietly, became rarer. Instead, her days were planned in advance by Oliver's staff, filled with activities meant to keep her polished and visible. Clara tried to brush aside the unease. After all, she reasoned, her life had changed drastically. Perhaps this was simply what came with marrying someone as busy and influential as Oliver. She didn't want to seem ungrateful. He had given her so much. Beautiful clothes, a home she could never have imagined, experiences she had once thought belonged only to other people. Still, small moments began to stand out. At public events, Oliver would sometimes walk ahead of her, leaving her to catch up in the click of high heels she still hadn't fully mastered. At dinners with his friends, conversations would swirl, with inside jokes and coded references that left her smiling politely, but feeling like an outsider. It wasn't just the social isolation that made her uneasy. She began noticing how controlled her image was. Oliver had insisted on managing her social media accounts, explaining that the press could twist even innocent posts into scandals. At first, she agreed, relieved not to deal with the overwhelming attention. But over time, she realized her online presence had become a carefully curated gallery of smiling photographs, luxury settings, and flattering captions that never seemed entirely like her voice. Even the candid moments were planned, the surprise breakfast in bed, the spontaneous walks through the park. One evening, while waiting for Oliver to finish a phone call in his study, she glanced at the papers on his desk. There were lists, dates, events, and notes in his handwriting about appearances they had made together. Some of the comments struck her as odd, written almost like a progress report. Good reception from media, * strong public reaction to. Contrast, maintain narrative for upcoming gala. * She didn't dwell on it too long, telling herself it must be part of his public relations work. But something about the clinical tone lingered in her mind. The public, for their part, remained fascinated by the couple. Tabloids ran endless stories about how Clara had captured the billionaire's heart. Some painted her as a fairy tale figure, while others hinted at hidden motives, suggesting she might be after his money. Clara hated those pieces, not because they accused her of greed. She knew the truth of her feelings, but because they reminded her that she would always be under a microscope. Oliver seemed unbothered by it all, assuring her that public opinion didn't matter. Yet she noticed how he collected the more flattering articles, leaving them where visitors might see them. As the months rolled on, the distance between them grew in ways Clara couldn't quite name. Oliver was affectionate in public, always ready, with a smile or a hand on her back, but in private he seemed distracted, his attention often elsewhere. Their conversations were brief, functional, and focused on schedules or upcoming events. She missed the way he had once listened intently, making her feel like the most important person in the room. Now, there were times when she wondered if he saw her at all. Her suspicions sharpened the day she overheard a fragment of conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Oliver had invited several of his friends over for drinks, and Clara had retreated to the kitchen to give them space. While passing the slightly ajar door of the sitting room, she caught a few words. Convincing so far. Just hold out till the end, and the payout will be worth it. The tone was low, almost conspiratorial, followed by laughter that made her skin prickle. She froze in place, trying to piece together the meaning. But before she could catch more, Oliver spotted her in the hallway and smiled as if nothing unusual had been said. That night, she tried to dismiss the memory. It could have been about business, she reasoned. Oliver dealt with high-stakes deals all the time. Still, something about the combination of words and the way they were said wouldn't leave her alone. She began paying closer attention, quietly watching for patterns in his behavior. Her unease deepened when she found herself in his study again weeks later, searching for a book he had recommended. Tucked under a folder on his desk was a slim, leather-bound notebook. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside were short notes, many of them familiar from the papers she had seen before. They were about her, descriptions of outfits she had worn, comments about public reactions to their appearances, even mentions of how her confidence had improved under guidance. One line made her stomach tighten. Final phase, charity. Ball reveal. She closed the notebook quickly, her hands trembling. The words could have meant anything, but they didn't feel innocent. The phrase charity ball stood out in her mind. She remembered Oliver mentioning it months ago, describing it as one of the most important events of the year. It was attended by politicians, celebrities, and business leaders, all under the glare of press cameras. She had thought of it as another night of formality and polite smiles. Now she wasn't so sure. Clara didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she began keeping a record of her own. In a plain notebook hidden in the back of her closet, she started jotting down moments that didn't make sense. Overheard conversations, odd phrases, notes about events where she had felt out of place. She told herself she was just trying to make sense of things, to quiet the growing unease. But deep down, she knew she was preparing for something. She also began noticing the subtle way Oliver's friends interacted with her. There was a certain glint in their eyes when they greeted her, a restrained amusement that made her feel as if she were the punchline to a joke she didn't understand. They would ask polite questions about her life, her thoughts on the events they attended, but their smiles always seemed a fraction too sharp. Once, she caught two of them exchanging a look when Oliver rested his hand on her back for a photographer. It was quick, but it burned into her memory. Despite the doubts creeping in, Clara tried to maintain her composure. She smiled for the cameras, wore the gowns picked for her, and played her part as the devoted wife. But inside, something had shifted. The foundation of trust she had built her new life on was starting to crack. She didn't know the full truth yet, but she could feel it. There was something wrong at the heart of her marriage, and whatever it was, she suspected it would surface sooner rather than later. By the time the invitation to the charity ball arrived, printed on heavy cream paper and edged with gold, Clara's unease had solidified into quiet resolve. She didn't know what Oliver was planning for that night, but she sensed it would be important. And for the first time since meeting him, she began to think not about how to please him, but about how to protect herself. The night of the charity ball arrived with the kind of winter chill that bit at the skin and carried the sharp scent of frost in the air. London streets glowed under strings of white lights, and the grand hall hosting the event stood like a jewel in the darkness, its stone facade illuminated in gold. Chauffeured cars pulled up one after another, releasing elegantly dressed guests into the glittering entryway. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scent of perfume, polished wood, and expensive wine. The chandeliers overhead cast a warm glow over polished marble floors, and the hum of conversation rose and fell in soft waves, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Clara stepped out of the sleek black car in a silver gown that flowed like liquid under the street lamps. Diamonds glinted in her pinned hair, and the chill of the night clung to her skin before she crossed into the warmth of the building. Cameras flashed in quick succession, and the sound of her name being called mixed with Oliver's. She smiled politely, holding her posture with the practiced grace she had learned over the past year. Inside, every detail seemed designed to impress. Towering arrangements of winter roses, tables draped in velvet, champagne flutes glittering under the cables. Lights. It should have been magical, but to Clara it felt like a stage, and she was painfully aware that the night might bring answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Oliver was in his element. He greeted guests with a confident ease, moving from handshake to handshake, his voice carrying just enough warmth to suggest familiarity without effort. Clara stayed close at first, her arm linked through his, but she noticed quickly that he didn't always look back to see if she was keeping pace. At times he drifted into small groups of his old friends, the same faces she had seen at private dinners and exclusive gatherings. Their eyes followed her in a way that set her on edge, not openly hostile, but filled with an odd, knowing amusement that only deepened her unease. Throughout the evening, Oliver kept checking the large clock above the balcony doors. The first time she noticed, she thought nothing of it, but as the pattern continued, her mind returned to the line she had read in his notebook. Final phase, charity ball reveal. The words echoed in her head like a drumbeat, their meaning still unclear but heavy with threat. She found herself scanning the room, searching for anything out of place. A sudden shift in mood. A signal passed between Oliver and his friends. Nothing obvious appeared, yet the tension in her chest grew taut as the night went on. She slipped away from Oliver's side under the pretense of visiting the powder room. Instead, she lingered in the shadowed hallway near the coat check, away from the noise of the main hall. From there, she could hear faint snatches of conversation from nearby alcoves. Most were harmless exchanges about business or travel plans, but then she caught a tone that made her still. Two men were speaking in low voices, one of them unmistakably one of Oliver's friends. The words weren't perfectly clear, but she heard enough. Asterisk, big moment. Finally cash in. She has no idea. A quiet laugh followed, then the sound of glasses clinking. Clara stayed frozen until their footsteps receded, her breath shallow as the meaning settled over her like a cold shroud. The pieces were coming together, but she still lacked the full picture. What she did know was that whatever Oliver was planning, it wasn't meant to celebrate her. Something inside her shifted then, a spark of steel replacing the uncertainty that had been growing for months. If there was going to be a reveal tonight, she would not stand silently and let herself be the victim. She made her way back to the ballroom with a new kind of calm, the kind that comes from a decision made quietly but firmly. The evening built toward the auction and speeches, the point where the most influential guests would gather near the stage. Oliver was scheduled to speak last, a fact that hadn't seemed significant to Clara before, but now felt deliberate. As the room filled with guests pressing closer to the podium, Clara noticed Oliver glance toward the group of friends who had been his shadow since their marriage began. One of them nodded almost imperceptibly, and Oliver's mouth curled into a half-smile she had never seen before. Not the charming public smile, but something sharper, almost triumphant. Clara's pulse quickened. She scanned the crowd again, her mind running through the contents of her hidden notebook at home, the fragments of overheard conversations, the notes she had seen on his desk. She hadn't brought that evidence with her, but she had something else, a small digital recorder she had been carrying for weeks, just in case. It was tucked inside the silver clutch she now held tightly against her side. She didn't know exactly how she would use it, but she knew she was done staying silent. Oliver's name was announced, and he stepped onto the stage, the lights catching the fine lines of his suit. He began with practiced ease, speaking about the importance of generosity, the success of the evening's fundraising, and the beauty of the hall they stood in. Clara could see the subtle changes in his expression as he moved closer to whatever point he was building toward. His friends were watching intently, their faces expectant. She thought about walking out, about leaving before he could say whatever was coming. But then another thought struck her. If she left, the narrative would belong entirely to him. She moved forward through the crowd, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. When she reached the edge of the stage, Oliver was just beginning to shift his speech towards something more personal. The words, "our marriage," left his lips, and in that moment, she stepped up beside him. The room hushed, the audience expecting some sort of romantic gesture. Oliver turned, surprise flickering in his eyes, though quickly masked. Clara reached for the microphone. He didn't let go immediately, but when she met his gaze, calm, steady, and unflinching, his grip loosened. The silence in the hall deepened as Clara spoke. She began simply, recounting the story as the public knew it, their meeting, their whirlwind romance, their wedding. Then her tone shifted. She told the room that not everything they had seen was real. She described the strange moments, the overheard fragments, the notes she had found. Her voice didn't waver as she pulled the recorder from her clutch and played a short clip. Oliver's friends speaking about the bet, about the payout, their laughter unmistakable. The sound echoed through the hall, turning the air thick with shock. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Oliver's friends began shifting toward the exits, their earlier smugness replaced with pale discomfort. Oliver stood frozen beside her, his expression unreadable but his stillness telling its own story. Clara finished by saying she had spent months questioning herself, wondering if she was imagining things, but that tonight she had decided she would not let the truth be buried under champagne and polite applause. For a long moment, the hall was silent except for the faint clink of glass somewhere in the distance. Then came the murmurs, growing into a swell of voices. Journalists were already scribbling notes, phones recording, cameras turning toward her instead of him. Oliver's perfectly crafted image was fracturing in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Clara stepped down from the stage without looking back, her clutch still in her hand, her silver gown catching the light as she walked out into the cold night. Outside, the air hit her face like a sharp breath of freedom. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement as the sounds of the ball faded behind her. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever game Oliver had been playing, it was over, and the final move had been hers. The fallout began before Clara had even reached home that night. By the time she stepped through the doors of the apartment, her phone was buzzing endlessly with calls from unknown numbers, messages from friends she hadn't heard from in months, and notifications from news outlets that had already picked up the story. Someone at the ball had streamed her speech live, and the video was spreading across social media like wildfire. The clip was short but devastating, Oliver standing frozen beside her as she calmly revealed that their marriage had been part of a cruel bet. The audio of his friend's laughter played over and over in countless reposts, each captioned with outraged. Within hours, headlines lit up every major news site. Billionaire's marriage exposed as vicious wager, * cruel bet shocks London's elite. Oliver Harrington humiliated at charity gala. * images from the night showed Clara in her silver gown, microphone in hand, standing tall under the bright lights. Some papers called it the bravest act they'd seen in years. Others dissected every detail, from the way Oliver's expression hardened to the pale faces of his friends as they tried to leave the hall. Oliver stayed away that night. Whether out of anger, shame, or strategy, Clara didn't know. She slept lightly, her mind buzzing with adrenaline and fragments of conversations from the past year. She thought about the girl she had been before she met him, quiet, certain that her life would remain small, and how she had been reshaped by his world. That reshaping had been meant to weaken her, but instead it had forged something else entirely. Resolved. By morning, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Paparazzi clustered outside the building, shouting questions when she appeared at the window. Several networks requested exclusive interviews. Clara ignored them all for the moment, focusing instead on the practical matters. She called a solicitor she had found weeks earlier, just in case her growing suspicions proved true. The woman listened without judgment as Clara explained the situation, then calmly outlined the steps they could take: filing for divorce, securing financial records, and preparing for the inevitable attempts Oliver would make to protect himself. The next days blurred into a steady rhythm of strategy and survival. Clara's solicitor worked quickly, leveraging both the public scandal and the private evidence she had collected to negotiate a divorce settlement that left Oliver with little room to maneuver. She had the recordings, the notes, and even some written exchanges between Oliver and his friends that left no doubt about the bet's existence. With the legal pressure mounting and his reputation collapsing in real time, Oliver agreed to the terms rather than endure a prolonged public trial. The settlement was significant, enough for Clara to live comfortably without relying on anyone again. While the legal process moved forward, Oliver's empire began to crumble. Several business partners severed ties within days, citing concerns about ethical integrity in official statements. Investors pulled out of deals, and at least 2 major projects were quietly dissolved. The social circles that had once embraced him turned cold, their members unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The same magazines that had once fawned over his glamorous lifestyle now published biting editorials about arrogance and cruelty among the ultra-wealthy. Clara, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a different kind of public reaction. She received letters and messages from strangers across the UK, women and men thanking her for standing up for herself, for refusing to be humiliated quietly. Some shared their own stories of betrayal and control, their words reminding her that while her circumstances had been unusual, the dynamics were painfully familiar to many. She read each message slowly, sometimes with tears in her eyes, realizing that the strength she had found in that ballroom had rippled outward far beyond her own life. Once the divorce was finalized, Clara left the apartment for good. She returned to her hometown, choosing a modest but charming house on a quiet street. The bakery she had once lived above was still there, the scent of fresh bread drifting into the morning air. For the first few weeks, she kept to herself, walking through familiar streets, rediscovering the comfort of anonymity. The cameras had followed her for a time, but without Oliver in the picture, the frenzy began to fade. In her own time, Clara began to rebuild. She used part of the settlement to open a small cafe, a warm and welcoming place filled with plants, soft lighting, and shelves of books for customers to borrow. She hired locals, some of them friends she had drifted away from. During her marriage, slowly, laughter returned to her days. She no longer woke to a schedule dictated by someone else's ambitions. There were no more curated photographs, no more rehearsed appearances, only moments that were hers to keep or share as she chose. Occasionally, she heard rumors about Oliver. There were whispers of failed ventures, sightings of him abroad trying to escape the shadow of the scandal. None of it interested her much. She had long since stopped thinking of him as the center of her story. The bet that had brought her into his life had ended up destroying his instead. The same arrogance that had driven him to accept the challenge had blinded him to the possibility that the woman he thought of as a pawn might step off the board entirely and take the game with her. One afternoon, nearly a year after the charity ball, a journalist who had been kind in their reporting asked to visit her cafe. She hesitated at first but agreed, setting boundaries about what she would and wouldn't discuss. Over tea, they spoke quietly in a corner about the night everything had changed. When asked what had gone through her mind as she took the microphone from Oliver, Clara answered simply, "I realized I could either be part of his story or write my own. I chose mine." The quote appeared in a small feature the following week, tucked between local news and cultural reviews. It was far from the front-page chaos of the year before, but to Clara, it felt more truthful than any headline she'd ever seen. As the seasons shifted, the scandal became just another story in the endless churn of public attention. For most people, Oliver Harrington was now a cautionary tale about greed and cruelty. For Clara, it was the chapter she had closed firmly, leaving space for a life she had built on her own terms. She still wore the silver gown from that night, once in a while, not for an audience, but for herself, as a reminder of the moment she had chosen to stand. She didn't think of herself as a symbol or an icon, though others still did. She thought of herself as someone who had been tested in a way she never expected, someone who had seen the worst in another person and found, to her own surprise, that she could meet it head-on. And as she locked up the cafe one evening, the sun dipping low over the rooftops, Clara felt a quiet satisfaction. The cruel bet that had been meant to break her had given her something Oliver had never intended, the unshakable knowledge that her worth had never depended on anyone's approval. Least of all his. The United Kingdom, once left speechless by the fairy tale wedding, had been left speechless again, but this time, not by the image Oliver had crafted. It was by the truth Clara had revealed and the life she had chosen afterward. And unlike the fleeting glare of cameras and headlines, that truth had a weight and permanence nothing could undo.